excellent energy management, not in formation. I think the last... very useful twin... Yes, one of them still exists, and is based at Oldbourne in Bedfordshire. And in addition to the vintage pair, I think we have at least two other chipmunks in the showground. A Portuguese chipmunk, regular visitor, but also in the centre of the showground where we have our nice arrangement of training aircraft throughout the years. Of course, you couldn't do that without a chipmunk. You just couldn't. This aircraft was designed as a replacement for the de Havilland Tiger Moth biplane elementary trainer for both the RAF and the Royal Canadian Air Force, this being a product, the Chipmunk, of de Havilland's Canadian arm. But it was also to be produced by de Havilland at its plants in Britain, at Hatfield in Hertfordshire, and at Harden, which we were talking about earlier, the birthplace. It was designed by a Polish émigré, one Zivrod Jakimiuk, who was the chief engineer of de Havilland Canada. And Francis St Barb, who was a director of de Havilland here in the UK, is reported to have said to Jakimiuk, "If you can make a good trainer, I will sell it." And didn't he make good that promise? Around 1,280 of these aeroplanes ended up being built, most of them in the UK. This aircraft, this monoplane as opposed to a biplane, found a very important market worldwide. And it was such a big advance over the Tiger Moth as well, because it had things like flaps and brakes and a radio. They've actually got quite a lot of altitude.
It does indeed.
And this is really going to be a display, as much as anything, of excellent energy management. 145 horsepower from one of the great British Aero engines, the de Havilland Gipsy Major 8. And you can see them converting that height into energy for their initial manoeuvre. It's quite a while actually since I've seen a formation aerobatic Chipmunk display. Solo aeros, yes, but not in formation.
I think the last I remember were the Caledonian Chipmunks, about 10-15 years ago.
Based up
in Scotland.
Perth, yes.
Perth. We had them display at Lucas a few times.
Yes, I've seen the likes of John Romain and Lee Proudfoot perform formation aeros in Chipmunks at Duxford, but this, as I say, a new departure for the vintage pair this year. An initial 3 loops. And turning tightly as they come up to the right-hand end of the display line. And of course, maintaining close formation, Andy, in low-powered aircraft like this, very challenging.
You can't just open the throttle and suddenly accelerate, or hit the brakes and suddenly slow down. You've got to... in aviation, we often talk about being ahead of the jet. We've certainly got to be ahead of the Gipsy here. If you think about what you need to do now, it's far, far too late.
A beautiful line astern barrel roll there, so named because they're basically describing the inside outline of an imaginary barrel positioned on its side in the sky. The first Chipmunks were delivered to the RAF 75 years ago this year to the Oxford University Air Squadron at Kidlington. Type is still on RAF charge because the Battle of Britain Memorial flight at RAF Coningsby has 2 of these aircraft for tail dragger conversion and refresher purposes. In fact, there are Chipmunks on the strength of all 3 of the historic
flights, the military historic flights in Britain, though those two now the only ones still on the military register because the Royal Navy Historic Flight is no more. Navy Wings Heritage Flight, they're represented here. They still have a Chipmunk, and we've got the historic Army Aircraft Flight Chipmunk, Army Air Corps Historic Aircraft Flight when it was in military hands, here in the static display.
And even in its primary role, certainly with university air squadrons and air experience flights, it stayed in service to the end of the 1990s. I mean, that's an incredible record.
Yes, 1996 was when the final ones were retired by the AEX, at that stage in favour of the Scottish Aviation Bulldog, which would also replace them with the University Air Squadrons. And then, of course, now we have the Groff Tutor in this role. And they were still in service with the Army Air Corps until 1997, with their basic fixed-wing flight at Middle Wallop. But we mustn't forget the other roles Chipmunks played in RAF service. One of the most famous was clandestine photographic reconnaissance with the RAF Gatow station flight in what was then West Berlin. The Allies had the right to fly around the Berlin control zone, and they used the opportunity for reconnaissance with various helicopters, but also light aeroplanes like a fleet of Chipmunks. And one of the last Gatow station flight Chipmunks is one of the two with the Battle of Britain Memorial flight today. In towards us for a lovely crossing break. Silver with the yellow training bands, and the later red and white.
Indeed, the red and white for me is the sort of real characteristic colour scheme
Yes.
for this aircraft.
Yes, it's the one I grew up seeing.
We used to call it support command colours.
Support command, absolutely. The Chipmunk was always a super display aeroplane as they come in for a crossover. The Havilland test pilot Pat Fillingham used to put on fantastic aerobatic displays of Chipmunks at Farnborough back in the 1950s, and there were later several display teams of them in the British military, the Blue Chips and the Skylarks in the RAF, and later, who included some incredibly distinguished test pilots carrying on flying, but performing basic flying grading for the Army.
As was of course done on the air experience flights,
Yeah.
of which this aircraft was a stalwart, obviously, where so many retired air officers see out their careers in instructing, taking cadets for their first experience. You sit next to Flying Officer Smith and you realise, no, it's Air Vice Marshal.
Yeah. Not many characters still used by the BDMF, the Chipmunk, also represented by the one leading this pair here, still used by all sorts of civilian operations for much the same purpose as it has ever been used, providing elementary tailwheel training. And we've said this often about a few aircraft in today's show, but have you ever heard anyone say much of a bad word about the Chipmunk's handling?
Absolutely not, absolutely not. Certainly one of those aircraft that just had enough about it to keep it, to not let you get lured into a false sense of security, which is just what you want in a training aircraft.
Right on the display datum. Yeah, that's the key thing, and that's something we'll come on to with the Harvard later. That is a terrible old cliche, I know, but easy to fly, difficult to fly well and accurately, but it is true.
Very true.
One of the Shuttleworth collection pilots, Richard Crockett, wrote that flying a Chipmunk is quite a lot of people have compared it to being a mini Spitfire, almost, in some respects. One of the things I'm finding really impressive about this display, quite a lot of brakes, immediate and very snappy rejoins.
It's not just very well flown, it's been very well put together. There's a lot of thought on it.
Yeah.
when to land.
Aircraft of the sort of progression a pilot can undertake on an aeroplane such as this, because when he was retired from the RAF, he was bought by the Higgins family, and John Higgins, the number 2 in this team, who we've seen display at Cosford individually and in this pair several times, was at one stage the youngest holder in the UK of a display authorisation from the Civil Aviation Authority. He was aged just 20 when he got his first DA. He's now got several hundred hours on Chipmunks and must be one of the most seasoned Chipmunk display pilots in the country. You'll see they're staying in close formation now as their sequence comes to an end, and I expect we're going to see a very nice close formation landing, and if it's anything like the landings I've seen them do as a pair at other events, it could well be a rather nice side slip formation landing.
It's certainly a very tight approach. I mentioned the Mustang making a curved fighter approach. There was good reason for that aircraft with the lack of forward view. I think the the vintage pair are doing it because they can.
Spitfire 1 line up and wait.
Well, I thought that was an absolutely splendid display by the vintage pair. David Petters in the lead, John Higgins, the number 2, with their pair of de Havilland Canada Chipmunk T.10s. Utter nostalgia, but a wonderful display in the present day.
So again, we just have a couple of moments. We're going to move a few aircraft as soon as the Chipmunks have vacated. We have the Dutch Spitfire to get airborne, and then we have the Beech 18. That's a nice 2 takeoffs there together. That's going to look very, very nice, and then we'll follow that up with the next display item at round about 10:02, which will be the mighty Royal Air Force F-35B. Yes, I can see the Dutch Spitfire on the runway, and there's actually said it's going to be followed off by the Royal Netherlands Air.
Clear to take off with 23006.
Clear to take off runway 24.
The Beech 18 cleared for takeoff as well. A very useful twin radial engine, light transport, particularly of the Second World War years, used by the RAF, notably with Southeast Asia Command, but also elsewhere as the Expediter. Rather similar in some ways, I suppose you could